having trouble getting the day planned out. So let's see if we can work something out ad hoc, shall we? How to get enough food every time with perfect balance, even if you eat crazy stuff and never planned anything before in your life. That's right, that sounds marketing-y enough. Here's what we know. Always start with what you know. We know that we need straight lines. Excellent, straight line. Here's what we know. We know that we have protons. We know that we have everything in frame, starch. And we know that we have fat. How do you get this perfect every time? Well, what we like to do is separate out the various food groups that contain these nutrients. To get everything perfect every time, there is a good order to plan everything in so that by the time you're done planning for the day or week or even meal, because this applies to all of those things, that it ends up coming out perfectly. What a lot of people end up doing is that they plug in a bunch of crap and then they end up playing like this weird like nutrient Jenga or nutrient Tetris until it ends up working out and it's a super frustrating experience. So instead of telling you to suck it up and to build your tolerance to frustration, I think it's better to just try and remove some of the frustration by making things a little more logical, okay? So here are the basic food groups in the context of planning your day out perfectly. There is complicated stuff. Complicated foods are foods that have typically all three macronutrients in them. This could be foods that come in packages. This could be other things like peanut butter that have protein, carbohydrate, and fat. This can be like oats. So these are the things that you definitely want to plan out first. All the complicated stuff you have in your day, you want to check this out first because they contain protein, starch, and fat in them. When you plan all the complicated stuff out first, then when you go to plan out the rest of your day with simpler foods that are ingredients rather than foods with ingredients, it's almost like you're planning your day with less food to plan in, if that makes sense. So you deal with the complicated stuff first, you erase that off from the top, and then you say, okay, now I'm going to plan my day. And the first thing that you end up planning your day with, in this context, is roughage. You go from complicated food to roughage. I use the term roughage loosely for a reason. Roughage is essentially your vegetables. This is the stuff that adds bulk. You can call it fruits and vegetables or whatever. This is mostly going to be vegetables, leaves, things that add bulk to your diet. Roughage mostly contains protein and starch and very small amounts of fat. The whole reason this is planned out first is because then you decide, okay, how hungry am I? Because the amount of roughage that you include in your diet is definitely going to be more of an indicator of how hungry you are rather than your perceived need for vanadium in your diet or chrome or whatever other, micronutrient type crap people think that they're keeping track of. This is all about logistics. So you have your complicated food first, foods that basically have ingredients instead of foods with ingredients, and then you go to roughage. All right, I'm super hungry, or my hunger is very low or my hunger is very high. Therefore, the roughage in my diet for the day or week is going to be very low or very high. And it's also very low calorie density, so it ends up taking up a very small percentage of how much food is enough for you. After that, after you include your roughage, you include your starch sources. So your complicated food is taken care of, your bulk is taken care of, then you add in starch, right? Starch contains, so it's the fat here is minimum. Starch contains, depending on the type of starch, it does contain protein. It obviously contains starch, and then the fat is going to be minimal. Now, at this point here, all of the carbohydrate is accounted for. All the carbohydrate is accounted for with these three inclusions, which that means the next things that you end up planning for are your protein sources and your starch sources. So your protein sources come next. These are mainly protein sources, and protein sources end up containing fat, and they end up containing protein in them, or very little to no starch. If there is more starch in it than protein, something like beans, that ends up getting included in the starch sources because the starch sources here also account for protein. So you would end up including vegetarian protein sources in the starch category and subtracting that from your total protein count. So your starch is already accounted for, your carbohydrate is accounted for. You end up doing your protein sources next, and your protein sources, of course, contain protein, negligible starch, and then fat. And now you actually have 4 food sources in a row that contain protein. So what you end up doing is that when you plan your protein in fourth, you top off your protein with your protein sources, if that makes sense. So now all of your protein is accounted for. Protein equals check mark, okay? Then the last thing you got to do is account for your fat sources. So these protein protein sources are closer to isolated, or not isolated protein, but concentrated protein sources. And then your fat sources are going to have no protein, no starch, and only fat. Excuse me. So this is essentially your oils, okay? If you're thinking about other fat sources, most other so-called whole food fat sources are actually going to be up here in the complicated food section because they contain protein, carbohydrate, and fat, like nuts, or even like avocados because they contain starch in them as well. So those other whole food fat sources that have fat in them, but they also contain carbohydrate and protein, those end up getting planned first in the complicated food section. So your complicated food and your roughage and your starch completely takes care of how much starch and carbohydrate is enough for you. All those starch sources contain protein. That means that a good portion of your protein for the day is taken care of. And that means you only need to include relatively concentrated protein sources to top off your protein. And when you top off your protein with protein sources, they contain fat, which means the only thing that you have left during the day is fat. And that is when you add whatever your oil or butter of choice would be, because that is essentially an isolated fat source. And this ends up topping your fat off. Fat equals check mark. So I'll go over this one more time. If you follow this plan, or if you follow this template, it could be for the week, it could be for the day, it could be for the meal even, you'll end up getting enough food every single time with a good distribution. So we're gonna go through this top to bottom one more time, and then you'll be fully prepared from a conceptual standpoint to plan your day however you'd like and make sure everything works out with good balance and you have enough, okay? So the first step is to plan out your complicated foods first. Complicated foods are foods that have ingredients rather than foods that are ingredients. Okay, so this is your packaged stuff. This is going out to restaurants. This is also other complicated foods that contain what are essentially all three macronutrients. So things like nuts, things like really oats, they contain all three macronutrients. So all of that complicated stuff gets planned out first. And then you just shave that off the top for whatever else you need for the rest of the day. After that, you decide, okay, how hungry am I? And if you're a hungry mofo, well, then your starch ends up going up really high. If you are a less than hungry mofo, well, then your roughage count ends up going really low. And your roughage mostly contains protein and starch. All right. That means that since you have some protein and have some starch and have some fat planned out already, since starch sources contain protein, whole food starch sources anyway contain protein, then you end up covering your starch requirements next. So then you fill up your carbohydrate requirements with starchy foods. So things like potatoes, things like rice, right? Those foods, they have protein in them. So you end up covering all of your starch sources with these three foods that you plan out first and a good portion of your protein. All right. So then after that, you include your protein sources for the day. You top off your protein, and those protein sources you add are going to have fat in them. They're going to have fat in them. Keep my notation here. That means your protein sources are topped off. Then all you got to do is top off the rest of your day with an isolated fat source. If you plan everything in this order, then the only thing you have left by the time you get to the fat source is you just got fat left. And that's when you say, okay, I'm going to put butter on stuff. I'm going to put olive oil on stuff. I'm going to put fish oil on stuff if that's your thing. So that's it. Hopefully you find it useful too. This is something that we've all done for years. This is how you end up planning out your day so you hit everything perfectly, really every time. And again, this is useful per meal, per day, or even on a weekly basis if you want to. This is how much I need for the week. You can multiply everything out, and then you can plan this way too. It's scalable, as big or as small as you want it to be. That is our getting enough food every time with perfect balance, even if you eat crazy stuff, right? You guys have a freaking awesome day. Throw down any questions or comments if you need any follow-ups, and until next time, Dr. Kashey is out. If you're picking up what I'm putting down and want to learn more about cognitive nutrition so you can finally live the life you deserve, then learn about my Kickstart program by clicking the link in the description box below.